We're going to get started. Thank you to everyone who is joining us today. My name is Catherine Dougal, and I am the Development and Engagement Specialist here at Bridge, Michigan. Today, we'll be discussing climate change and environmental justice in Michigan. And this event is a part of Bridge, Michigan's monthly lunch break series, where we discuss issues important to Michigan residents. If you aren't familiar with Bridge already, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan statewide news organization, and you can read our coverage every day for free online at bridgemi.com. I also want to thank our Bridge members who are here with us today and who help support our work. If you are not already a member and would like to become one, you can do so anytime on our website. And our membership director, Amber DeLinde, who you just heard from, is going to drop a link into the chat. So the schedule for today's discussion is that we'll begin with a conversation between Bridge, Michigan environment reporter Kelly House and our special guests, and then we'll open the discussion to reader questions, which you can put into the chat feature at any time. Throughout the discussion, if you are not calling in today, you can email your questions to us at membership@bridgemi.com. Just so you know, we are recording this and we'll be posting the recording in Bridge later today or tomorrow. So now on to introduce the special guests we have joining us today. First, we have Dr. William Shuster, who is the Department Chair and Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Wayne State University. Dr. Shuster is an interdisciplinary environmental scientist and engineer with an emphasis on teaching, research, and scholarship in the management of wastewater and stormwater, maximizing social equity and inclusion in the services that we get from civic infrastructures, and preventative engineering practice to avoid negative unintended consequences or outcomes. We are also joined today by Michelle Martinez, who is the Acting Executive Director of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. Since 2006, she has worked in local communities of color to build power to halt climate change and the detrimental effects of pollution in Detroit. In 2019, she helped organize the March to make Detroit the engine of the Green New Deal, leading up to the Democratic national debate, bringing candidates Governor Jay Inslee and Senator Elizabeth Warren to Southwest Detroit's most polluted zip code, 48217. She was a 2017 Equity Fellow at Wayne State University Law School's Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights and received the top 25 Latinx leaders from the state of Michigan Hispanic Latino Commission in 2019. She earned her MS in Environmental Policy from the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources Environment, now SEAS. And I'm going to pass it over now to my colleague, Bridge, Michigan environment reporter Kelly House, to get us started.
Hi, and thanks to both of you for being here and sharing your expertise with our readers. I know everyone just got a quick primer on the work you both do, but could you each just tell us a little bit more about the specifics of that work and how it plays out in Michigan communities?
Would you?
And I guess I'll ask Michelle to go, or yeah, whoever wants to
go ahead. Go ahead, Michelle.
I'd love to hear from
Great, thanks. Yeah, happy to pass the mic. And thanks to Bridge Magazine today, and thanks, Kelly, for your amazing reporting on environment, excuse me. So I work for MEJC, Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, and we work with our membership, 40 plus members, to ensure that everyone, no matter what you look like or what's in your bank account, that you have access to clean water, breathable air, good food, and a future safe from climate change. And right now, we know that issues such as hazardous waste, air pollution, the cost of utilities really hit working class and poor families the hardest, especially Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So we're really solutions focused. We want to work on real solutions, not some of these half-baked market fluff that only make money for billionaires. Our work is really focused, and the work of our colleagues is to make sure that people in Michigan really benefit, and that our elected officials invest in our homes to create good, strong jobs in the green economy and to protect our kids' future. So thanks so much, and I'll pass it over back to you.
Thanks, Michelle. So I draw on 20 years, nearly 20 years of experience working for a national laboratory at the federal EPA. And of course, my national service mission has shifted to a more local service mission at Wayne State University, where primary mission, of course, is to educate civil and environmental engineers who are prepared to take on and account for the vulnerabilities and the inequity of critical services delivered from civil and environmental infrastructure. And we have wastewater issues, we have stormwater issues, there's waste management issues. This all falls into the civil environmental context. So the idea here, and I'm sure we'll be focusing a bit on serial flooding that we've experienced in particular Dearborn, downriver communities, and then the east side writ large in Detroit, and how this has highlighted what I call disproportionate data equity. We're not benchmarking our communities in terms of vulnerability, and we need that kind of data to then engineer equitable infrastructure and services. So I'll leave it at that.
And so, pardon me, you just touched on one of the many climate impacts that we have seen in Michigan, sort of repeatedly in the past few years. We have had the dramatic fluctuations in Great Lakes water levels, warming water temperatures and loss of winter that's impacting water quality, and of course, dramatically and very recently, repeat extreme rain events causing widespread flooding and devastation. Can you both speak to how those are impacting communities on the ground? Because of course, we know what a flood is, but, for instance, in the recent floods, following them, there was, a warning around Legionnaire's disease. We sort of are starting to see these compounding impacts. And I guess I'll start with you, Bill, this time, and then go to Michelle.
Well, the flooding in particular is an equal opportunity disruptor and destroyer of property, morale, and basically it's a cessation or interruption of services. It's very profound. And so we're talking about people with a $7,000 house being affected equally, people living in a $2 million house. And the idea of social equity starts to come into play when we talk about how we cope with these disruptor events. I can't overstate the impact on every aspect of civic services. We're looking at 15 cubic meters of solid waste for 75% of the houses in any of the affected areas. That pulse that has an impact. We have limited landfill space, and where are those landfills located? So not only are lives disrupted, health, property destroyed, but we also, the impacts radiate out. And I should hand it to Michelle there.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I mean, over the past 4 weeks has been completely traumatic for many of the residents of Detroit and the surrounding communities who have literally been digging out of human waste in their flooded basements and junking perfectly good cars inundated with the dark waters from these historic rainfalls that you're mentioning, Kelly. I mean, totally overwhelmed by the failing wastewater infrastructure. I mean, our organization in partnership with a mutual organization called Southwest Cares, helping elders who literally cannot climb the stairs up and down, trying to avoid mold situations, undocumented people worried that they're not going to be able to receive FEMA funding because their fear of deportation, right? We're talking about major appliances too, right? If you have to replace a boiler, if you have to replace a water heater, and then you do, and 3 weeks later it's trashed again, if you have very expensive homeowners insurance, which Detroit ranks some of the highest rates of homeowners insurance. So we're looking at, catastrophic flooding, but very, very weak social infrastructure to help people who are vulnerable respond. This is not the first time. 2 years ago, You might remember the shoreline collapse due to the historic high lake levels, exposing uranium waste from the Manhattan Project post-war. That problem still is not solved. The city council is sitting on the Detroit River Protection Ordinance and still has not put in the kinds of protection that would prevent that kind of thing from happening again. So not only are we experiencing these weather events, but again, the social infrastructure is not responding quickly enough to help those who are most vulnerable and most impacted. And this is what happens, right, when we have multi-generational disinvestment like we do in Detroit. It's highly racialized, and it's really in exchange for corporate profits and power at the behest of residents' health and safety. So this is not just a meteorological problem, it's a political problem that Michigan needs to contend with.
And you just mentioned that political problem. I'm curious, you know, and the sort of nexus between infrastructure and then climate that adds stress to already, you know, weakened infrastructure. There was just a sort of announcement of an initial agreement on a federal infrastructure package. I'm curious what, and I know it's new, so maybe the details are not that well fleshed out yet, but do you have thoughts on the package itself, what's in it and what's not, and also what you would like to see that money be used for in Michigan when it comes to climate preparedness and adaptation?
Well, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to correct structural deficiencies in, you know, basically at every scale, at the parcel level, at the neighborhood level, the community level. And we all know that our sewer infrastructure underlays our entire, you know, each of these parts of the city. And it's a very profound impact on how, in fact, you know, our cities are drained and how we move water around. And in water-rich Detroit, we have to understand our relationship with water. We live very intimately with water, especially in places like Jefferson Chalmers, for example. But that's just one end of the continuum. We all have to coexist with water, or, you know, because it always wins. And so what we are talking about is large infrastructure improvement, you know, at the scale addressed by the bill. I'm not familiar with the particulars at this point, but to equalize services and to prevent private property as well as public property to becoming temporary storage assets for basically our wastewater and stormwater management providers in the area, namely GLEWA would probably be the most appropriate. We really need to take a data-based approach, understand the extent of the problem, that we have friendly undersized infrastructure, and the Lower East Side and Dearborn is kind of a pass-through for large amounts of stormwater volume or wastewater volume coming through our East Side communities. So how do we rectify these? And this is where it's thinking big, but making sure that we, again, get data equity into the mix, benchmarking the water budgets, how water moves or does not move through our communities. That's wastewater, groundwater, surface water levels. It all has to be integrated to create what I see as a coherent approach to managing and ensuring that we're not getting these kind of disastrous floods. It has legacy impacts on every aspect of our infrastructure. You know, after you've been flooded several times or building up pressure on foundation walls, it just fundamentally changes the sustainability, the resilience of housing, businesses, and I think, as Michelle pointed out, it just radiates into our ability to have any kind of economy where services are available and people can actually actualize in their communities.
Yeah, that's right, Bill. I mean, these historic events just highlight the need for urgency. I mean, a historic amount of Michiganders went out to the polls and voted for President Biden, who outlined an economic recovery plan through the American Jobs Plan. And it's in black and white there. And so what our job right now at MEJC is to make sure that those benefits go to the communities that have been hardest hit not only by the flooding of the last years, but by the constant barrage of pollution that we've been dealing with. Michigan is #1 in the disproportionate impact on commercial hazardous waste to people of color, #1 in the nation. We ship commercial hazardous waste from as far away as the Mariana Islands in the Pacific Ocean to store it on Detroit's east side. So we have a lot of really complex issues that need to be funded. And so we're asking that President Biden, the administration, and Congress look at the Justice 40 initiative, which would direct 40% of the benefits from the infrastructure package to those who have been bearing the burden of industrial pollution for 3 generations or more. That would not only help Detroit, Flint, and other communities, but rural communities that are struggling financially to make ends meet for basic infrastructural needs. So these kinds of things would help create jobs. We know that we have the jobs number. What we need, again, is the political will to make sure that that infrastructure package hits the ground for everyday people and not have corporations swoop in again and gobble up all of those dollars before it hits Detroit.
And Michelle, you just touched on, the hazardous waste issue in marginalized communities, particularly in Southeast Michigan. And that's making me think of a conversation you and I had several months ago about environmental justice policy priorities at the state level. And I want to use that as an opportunity to ask you, we've been talking about federal dollars and spending. Are there policy changes that are needed at the state level to help address some of the inequities that you've both been talking about and further environmental justice?
Absolutely. I mean, the policy changes that need to happen are at the federal, the state, the county, the local municipal level. I mean, a perfect example of some of the policies we've been pushing for is for justice and equity and climate planning with the governor, making sure that Governor Whitmer knows that those communities who have been struggling the hardest and for the longest should be receiving those benefits first and foremost, whether or not it's through an emergency response plan when something like this flooding or a flare-up at Marathon Oil, the state's only oil refinery, happens. How do people know, right? An incident a few years ago happened and folks didn't know. Those residents in Dearborn or Melvindale were actually alerted through their police texting messaging, but Detroit residents did not. We need to fix some of those problems. Detroit's Proposal P, for example, we learned yesterday that DTE Energy is bankrolling efforts on what has been donned against the People's Charter. It's the governing document for the city on the ballot this year, and Proposal P includes key provisions that would operationalize interagency cooperation immediately when disaster happens. And Proposal P also builds in the funding necessary to help kids who are having breathing problems, right, and help mitigate the pollution that is coming from some of these smokestacks and tailpipes with an environmental justice health fund. Now, why would a fossil fuel company like DTE Energy want to stop Detroiters from having an emergency response plan to environmental disasters? We need to stop corporations from playing politics in our backyards so that the state, the local, the county, and the federal government can all start to move funding forward to create the kind of solutions that are out there. And they're so abundant, and they're right at the fingertips of our decision makers who we elected.
I think there's a lot of funding sources that have different eligibility criteria. So, for example, we've had ongoing flooding on the east side and leaving a lot of houses that were already in poor condition in worse condition. And so how do we funnel those existing resources and any additional resources from the infrastructure bill we're talking about repairing a roof and then running electric to the attic so that the HVAC system can be put in the attic, and then basically abandoning the basement and putting the hot water heater and laundry on the first floor. This is a huge construction engineering and project management effort. But at the same time, you're trying to stabilize residences, pretty much the fundamental fabric of our neighborhoods, in a way that's by adding internal drainage, a sump pump. There's a lot of talk about check valves, but these have very specific engineering sizing criteria and maintenance, and that all costs money, and it has to be done in an integrated way. If just a few people do it, this can be a problem. If a lot of people do it, that's a different plan right there. But the prevention of these, by taking these sorts of measures and, disaster proofing, making more resilient, again, the fundamental residential and business structures that are our neighborhoods. That's really, because we're taking on the cost of damages is so much more. And if these are serial damages, like we've seen in the last month, we had a 8-inch rainfall and about a 3-inch rainfall and then an inch rainfall event just last Saturday evening. Each of those caused different levels of flooding throughout the east side. So something is, there's analysis that needs to be done in mapping who is affected and was it septic, was it stormwater, clear stormwater, or both, and how, who, where, when. And then you start to be able to make some generalizations. Well, this part of the infrastructure is not working, is undersized, or needs to be replaced or completely redesigned.
Can I ask a kind of a technical question, but it's, as you were talking about, sort of the systemic level actions we can take, building, infrastructure that is capable of withstanding worsening storms, and then the individual level need for people to be retreating from their basements potentially, or finding ways to, if a flood happens, it won't hit you as an individual as hard next time. Is there, and I don't know if either of you can speak to this, but it was on my mind as you were talking about that. Are we sort of at this point baked into having some amount of flooding in people's homes or, in streets in Southeast Michigan? Or can we build, bigger pipes and bigger bioswales enough to eliminate the flooding altogether?
I think you bring up a really important point, Kelly. There's a lot of talk about balance between gray infrastructure or piped conveyances, pumps, lift stations, different assets that move wastewater and stormwater around our communities. And then there's green infrastructure, which can be complementary, but also really requires a lot of assessment and proper design going into the process to make sure that it's fulfilling its retention goals. It's keeping the water that we think it's keeping and moving it around in such a way that it's not interfering with our existing wastewater infrastructure, or becoming a part of the problem by creating runoff when it's overwhelmed. And so apparently we are looking at ongoing flooding just based on the last month of these, basically flooding insults. And whether they're the question of, these are extreme rainfall events that are largely unpredictable because it falls outside of a statistical treatment. We don't have the kind of data when we call it a 1,000-year event, that's really at the tail end of the data. We don't have a lot of data supporting what a 1,000-year event is. And you can pretty much wake up the next morning after a 1,000-year event and have another one. And this is, so there is some urgency, I believe, to recast, prediction. And there's a good article in the Washington Post about that from a while back. But it's all interlocked. We have to spend a bit more time designing gray or green infrastructure along the realities. Whether we're going to, I don't think we're going to be digging up pipes. You can just imagine the effort that it takes to basically dig up and separate systems. However, there is a role for gray and green infrastructure to rebalance and get these systems, at least if they're undersized, running at peak efficiency, and then add in carefully planned green infrastructure to keep some of that runoff out of the gray system. See what I'm saying?
Well, I'm glad we have an engineer here to explain some of those things. I admittedly am not an engineer, but we do work in the political side, right? And Ms. Jones or Ms. Oates or any of the folks who we're helping right now on the ground don't have options, and they don't have time to wait for the federal government or the state to decide what the right design is. They need help now. And moving or detaching yourself from your community and your home and the people who take care of you is a really, really hard decision, right? That's why we need 100% hands on deck, everybody on board, willing to help to make the enormous and transformational changes that we need now, right? I think the United Nations and has told us we only have 10 years to do it, right? We only have 10 years, the year 2030, if we don't dramatically transform our economy and our society, we're not going to be able to respond, right? And I would argue that that's already happening for our friends and neighbors in Detroit. People are not able to respond. If you have respiratory issues and you're sitting in your living room while mold is growing in your basement, or if there's E. coli where your cousin is sleeping, right, on a mattress in the basement, that's already a critical issue. That's already a life and death decision. Right? So what we need as a society to do is start generating those options, right? Using the precautionary principle. What we see happening is beyond what our modeling can happen. These dynamic systems, right, are largely unpredictable, right? NOAA, officials at NOAA are telling us, yeah, we had modeled towards this, but some of the things that we thought were going to be happening 10 years are happening now, right? So we can't wait. We need huge amounts of infrastructure and investment money, and we need corporations and people playing politics in our backyard to get out of the way so that we can come up with real solutions for people who are struggling with this today.
The idea of adaptation, I think, is key here, and getting, again, our houses, our businesses, retrofitted, for the new reality. That we do have, a fundamentally undersized system that needs to be rebalanced. There's too many flows coming in from, it's a very large service area that GLEWA maintains. And, it's a valid question whether they can actually contract and fulfill, those services under obligation. I always take an opportunity to, this is, I think, a very important book. It comes out of Wayne State for us. It's by Alicia Montgomery, and it's called Greening the Black Urban Regime, the Culture and Commerce of Sustainability in Detroit. There's a lot of good civil and environmental engineering in this book. Dr. Montgomery is a friend of Detroit, and she writes it on the basis of her experience here. In the, I believe, earlier part this decade, and basically making it required reading for undergraduates in my program. She's able to translate very clearly the imperative for basically service, equity in services, and spatial agency that the minority of Detroit have not enjoyed or had access to. And so this book, I believe, has helped me develop some fundamental understandings about how this is, how this doesn't work anymore, and with implications for, getting, communities of opportunity, services, and actual infrastructure that's really at the fore.
Yeah, that's right, Bill. And we haven't actually talked about, the climate impacts beyond flooding, right? And some of that is heat. So we know that, in Southwest Detroit or in Detroit writ large, we often have ozone action days. Now, ozone is not the big ozone atmosphere, but ground level ozone. Some people have a hard time making that distinction, but it is nitrous oxides plus heat plus volatile organic compounds, all things that come out of smokestacks and tailpipes. Now, when you have multiple hot heat days, that ozone actually makes your lungs kind of swell up. So in Detroit and other areas where folks already have respiratory issues from ongoing environmental contamination and air pollution, hospital emergency rooms fill up on high heat days. So we need to really even be thinking about not only the actual built environment of our structures and our homes and how to keep them cool, but cooling centers, right? How to maintain a grid and how to decentralize our grid and microgrid infrastructure so that all of those air conditioners that are running all over the place aren't bearing down on one facility, on a DTE facility that might shut down, right? Because everybody's running their AC at the same time in Southeast Michigan. So yeah, these are complex problems, but there are solutions and they are so abundant, right? And I think what we're getting at is that the political will, the investment, the deployment of a workforce that's ready for the green economy is all possible today, right? We need a huge amount of voters, right? Of people knocking doors, going to their school boards, going to their city councils, going to their county officials and asking them, what are you doing about climate? How are we going to be directing these funding sources that are coming down through the federal system to make sure that they are effective and make sure that we have a good plan for the next 2-3 generations? Who will be bearing the brunt of this?
And that brings me to another question I'm thinking about, which is, these conversations are not new. There's definitely new and added urgency every time there's a new, major flood event or major heat event. But, we have had Michigan's Climate Action Plan initially was, I think, 2009. There was the 21st Century Infrastructure Task Force, which highlighted a lot of the looming threats that we have since seen in the repeated flooding and in the dam breaks and things. I guess from both of your perspectives, why has it been so hard to get movement on these conversations when they have been around for a while? And how do you feel we are doing right now? I know that currently Michigan, our current administration has made environmental justice a priority, has said it's got a carbon neutral goal, but where are we on actually delivering on those, stated commitments?
I'll ask Michelle to start off with that one.
Yeah, absolutely. We've come so far, right? This is the first time in a presidential administration, in our gubernatorial administration, that out the gate, right, in the first 90 days of the administration, that we were able to sit down and really talk about what kind of environmental justice priorities are needed, right? And so that is due to the huge amount of work, activists, organizers, hitting the streets, knocking the doors, doing protests, you know, in Warren County, North Carolina, laying down on the streets to prevent PCBs from entering into a historically Black community, right? This just didn't happen. This was due to years of sacrifice of many, many people, right? And the struggle continues, right? We know right now that some of the policies and policy changes that we need are going to be an incredible uphill battle. That's why we need everybody on this call and all of your friends, neighbors, local officials to be calling our senators, calling Debbie Stabenow, telling her we need real solutions. We need community direct investment to Detroit and other struggling communities so that we can have the kind of solar rooftops for all, so that we can have breathable air, right? So that we can have enforcement mechanisms for corporations who treat our lands like the wild, wild west, right? That time is over. We can't afford it anymore. And so those are the kinds of things that we need, not false solutions. You know, from the other side, we have a lot of people who are buying into these ideas that, oh, well, if we create a kind of market mechanism and we let corporations trade these things, that will result in the reduction of greenhouse gases. Well, I'll tell you what, it's projected to be a multi-billion-dollar trading system globally, right? But does it work? And that's the real question. It's been tested in California. It's been tested in Europe. Greenhouse gases have been shown to only reduce between 0 and 2% due to market mechanisms, right? And so we can't be duped by this science fiction billionaire idea that keep on making money for fossil fuel companies while they continue fracking and putting a cigarette filter on their natural gas plants. What we need is a mass deployment of renewable energy, a renovation of our homes, a renovation of our water systems, right? And a way for people to get around, right? With low emission vehicles, cleaning up our international ports, right? Helping people pay their bills through this period, right? Those are the kinds of solutions that bring equity to our extremely still racially segregated geographies in Michigan, right? We need that to be able to support people no matter what they look like, no matter what's in their bank account, so that we can all survive this next period. It's the political will, and only we can do it, right? Only we can demand it. And that's what's needed right now to make us get over those challenges and the corporateering, right, that's happening in the background.
Well, and to follow on from that, the American Society of Civil Engineers issues a report card for American infrastructure each year. And if you look at the grades that we're getting for infrastructure, they're very low. And so from an engineering standpoint, it's well known that our infrastructure has been falling apart, is falling apart. And so the idea of reinvestment and a kind of a social commonwealth approach to this is key. And it's going to do things with taxes. It's going to do things with discretionary income for those that have it. But is it even feasible to live without critical infrastructure services, or to live in fear of ongoing vulnerability? And that cuts across all socioeconomic levels. And so, really the political will has to drive it forward. But we've seen cuts in not necessarily regulatory agencies at the state and federal level, but that's arguably true, but also the inspection of basic infrastructure. Chances are you're going over a bridge anywhere in Michigan, there is, depending on the bridge, there is some potential for that bridge to fail. Or it's beyond its service life. It has, significant structural flaws. And that's serious business at that point, and has been for some time. So overcoming it is a cognitive dissonance. Is it being hit over the head with $1 billion price tag? Maybe that's where the infrastructure bill can really make some inroads, some sort of civilian conservation corps, mobilizing to really get a number of people out there working on these projects and actually making significant progress at the community level, but also at the state level.
And I'm curious, we've talked a lot about, the more urban parts of the state. Of course, those have had major, major impacts very recently. But as you've both noted, we are all experiencing and will continue to experience the impacts of a changing climate. How do those issues and the justice issues that go along with them look different or similar in urban spaces versus rural spaces?
I think I'll kick off with that one. It was actually in Bridge that I read about basically the sorry state of water infrastructure, drinking water, wastewater infrastructure in our rural areas in Michigan. And these are, bona fide, productive communities, full of Michiganders, and who deserve services. But these have been underfunded, and through serial, legacy disinvestment, lack of operation and maintenance over time have led to untenable bills for, or prices to get the systems back on as these communities, have undergone depopulation over the years. So this is a significant social and political matter here. Is, again, how do you get equal services to each, regardless of where you live? And as Michelle pointed out, what's in your bank account? And I think that's fundamental. These are antiquated systems that most of rural Michigan are working with. And whether they're actually, functioning at all is a relevant question for many communities.
Yeah, that's right. The cost of aging infrastructure in Michigan is really bearing down on families, both in urban Michigan, like Flint, Benton Harbor, Detroit, Saginaw. This has been in the news quite a bit, but the burden that rural communities are experiencing is also very, very high. So this year, MEJC conducted research with We Want Green Too and the University of Michigan. Last year, again, with the University of Michigan School of Public Health and SEAS. And we found that, through interviewing 650 people in the Upper Peninsula and in Detroit, fast rising energy rates, right? Lack of support for renewable energy is really bearing down on people all over the state. People are paying an energy burden, in some cases upwards of 10, 12, 14, 30% of their income, and it's just not sustainable. Detroiters are experiencing power outages more often and for longer periods of time, and they have less alternate fuel options. So as one interviewee says, hey, we just turn on that propane, or we go and chop down a tree and light that fire. Unfortunately, if anybody has had to try to rebuild their chimney in their house, I know it's quite costly. So, we need more options. Some of the research also that the University of Michigan found was that in Southeast Michigan, Black residents are not only most impacted by the high heat that I've already spoken about compared to urban residents, but Detroiters consume less energy and pay a greater proportion of their income for it. So high rising energy rates across the board. There's a very easy solution for that, and it's called the percentage of income payment plans, and it's affordable rate structures that can be proposed to the Michigan Public Service Commission by the utilities, and yet they continue to fight us on things like lifting the cap on rooftop solar. Utilities continue to fight us on affordable rates, continue to fight for massive corporate profits above reinvesting back into that infrastructure. And so we have to hold these companies accountable for doing the kinds of things that they're doing, because again, these high wind events that we're experiencing that are almost nearing sometimes a hurricane level experience are taking down power all over the state. right? So how can we be more resilient? That's a climate solution, and it's on the table already with the federal government, right? Solar energy for all, investment in grid revitalization, right? Making sure that community distributed generation and solar energy technologies like battery storage are invested in so that it can become more available and it become more affordable for regular people who want to put solar. You know, I want to live in a world where DTE Energy is sending me a check for generating enough energy on my rooftop to be able to sell it to my friends and neighbors at an affordable price. But again, that political will to be able to implement those solutions and providing the kind of investment that we need is what's going to help us both in urban and rural Michigan.
And I want to get to a few reader questions because I know we're going to be wrapping up in about 15 minutes here. Much has been made about the potential of the Great Lakes region, including Michigan, to be a climate refuge, you know, a place that, relatively speaking, will continue to be hospitable in times when the West is increasingly arid, you know, parts of the coastal US are being inundated. Obviously, we've touched on many of the barriers to that already in terms of not having infrastructure that can currently support who's living here now. I'm curious from both of you, one, do you see that happening? Do you see Michigan either currently or in the future becoming sort of a place where we are having people move because their homes are not as hospitable? And two, I know that often comes with concerns about displacement or, you know, unintended consequences resulting from that influx. So how do we prepare for that without having those unintended consequences? And I guess I'll start with Michelle.
Yeah, climate gentrification is a well-studied phenomenon at this point, and it goes from the lack of policy to help protect people who don't make a lot of money, right? So, you know, it's very easy. I want to live in a world where everybody has clean water to drink. I want to live in a world where people are housed and safe from bodily harm, right? Where food is abundant and regardless of what the color of your skin is or what's in your bank account determines where or how you live, right? So, you know, I think Michigan believes that too. You drive around the summer to the Great Lakes and you see beautiful farmlands, you see families cooking barbecues together, you see swimming, fishing, and people feeling joy from having survived with one another through COVID, through a pandemic, right? But when we allow these corporations to rig the game against us, paying tens of thousands of dollars, developers, utility owners, fossil fuel companies to kill something like Proposal P in Detroit or rooftop solar or fair utility rates, these are the types of policies that help to ensure those things are afforded to everyone, right? Regardless of what's on your paycheck. So the crisis of climate is actually meeting the crisis of democracy. And that's the takeaway, right? When these weather events become more severe and people are fleeing, if we don't have the protective policies in place that are going to help everybody survive, then we're going to be in a whole heck of a lot of trouble in Michigan and Detroit, which is the most segregated place in the United States. But I believe people can come together, and we did, to change the politics in Michigan. We're going to be redistricted this year, and we're going to start afresh next year with a ballot initiative and the Citizen Redistricting Commission, so that we can create and vote in elected officials that will make Michigan the place where everyone can survive.
Well, again, I call it a good article in Bridge on, I believe it's in Bridge, on Duluth and how they're approaching basically climate refugees, but also the fact that many of the climate refugees have, you know, a great deal of financial capital to change their circumstance and decrease their vulnerability. However, Duluth is very different demographically than majority minority Detroit. And so how do we look at the vast tracts of vacant land? This is something that I've studied very closely, and understanding what are, you know, why do we have vacant land? And what does the vacant land as it sits right now, what does that do for us? But namely, what would be the future of this land and how, to accommodate, potentially large numbers of people. It's said that the last peoples will live in the Great Lakes region because of the freshwater resources. So what it becomes fundamentally equity and infrastructure, planning ahead. Are you going to layer on top, a large influx of people with the respective, residential structures and businesses to support, that new population? Are you going to layer that on top of infrastructure that can't handle it already? And, there was a ill-advised plan at one point in Detroit, I believe, around when the original emergency manager was in place to set up zones, basically allowing people, giving them credit to get out of a certain area of Detroit and then shutting down all services, which just seems absurd in retrospect for people who sustained through legacy disinvestment, a great deal of social and economic change. And so I really think that it's an infrastructure first effort. And if we do anticipate this, then you basically set the table to make that happen in an equitable way. Money talks. If people are bringing in large investments, I think that would have to be looked at very carefully in terms of, again, the equity issue.
And going back to this infrastructure question, we have a reader asking, what is, or is there a right balance between the green infrastructure, things like big catchment ponds that can help reduce flooding during storms, and the gray infrastructure, like building bigger pipes or right sizing the system that's there?
It's a great
already?
question. And this is an area of research and development, I think, around the nation. Green infrastructure can't do everything. And so let's get specific here. In Detroit, we have a pretty shallow groundwater table, especially on the east side, and even more so in an area like Jefferson Chalmers, where it's basically a marsh that was built upon many years ago. And so there's a rich cultural history in living with water that is now more and more impactful. So if we're going to be building green infrastructure, we need to be moving water out of areas that have too much water to start with and bringing that back into what's known as the urban water cycle, that moves water through our neighborhoods. And of course, water always wins. We can't kind of outguess water and its intents. And so, this becomes, adaptation. I think that, again, benchmarking our communities for their unique water balance is going to be key in developing the right kind of infrastructure. Green infrastructure is often considered a rain garden or pervious pavers. And those can work, to again, they have to be properly sized and designed to be, get maximum effect, and to make sure that, for example, when we're raining on a rain garden, as that water flows through the rain garden, some of that is blown off as what we call transpiration. The plants during the warm season will actually move that soil water into the atmosphere. And then some of it will keep on moving downward into the groundwater table. If there's a pipe that has cracks, like many of our pipes do, wastewater conveyances that basically crisscross the subsurface of our communities, then we're reducing that water that gets into those pipes. It's known as rainfall-derived inflow and infiltration. That robs our system of capacity when we need it the most during storm flow. And so, again, that's an influence on we have to make sure that our green infrastructure is sited and situated by knowing something about the context and the place that it's in before, developing these large or even small piecewise projects.
And we have a couple of questions that I'm going to kind of smush into one because I know our time is limited, but I have a couple of readers here who are asking, what can I do? Essentially, one says, what are the best recommendations for individuals to be able to combat climate change locally? And the other person asks, should we be recycling still? It seems like there's not a lot individuals can do aside from voting. Is that true? So do you have thoughts for folks who are wondering how they can, be part of addressing climate change locally?
Yeah, as activists say, get in where you fit in, find a good fight and start doing it. I see Mary Ellen Howard on here, who's a leader and an elder. Hi, Mary Ellen, fighting for water rights, right? As water is life. Everyday people, go to your neighbors, start a petition, go to your neighborhood council, start attending with a group of 5 people, your city council. Bird Dog Debbie Stabenow, go to Gary Peters, ask, what are you doing to bring home money for climate and infrastructure? And keep doing it over and over and over. We are small but mighty. And you think, oh, it doesn't matter if it's me and 4 people. It does. You would be astounded how easily corporate executives walk into elected officials' office and say, we want this, this, and this, and it shows up in a bill. We need to take our democracy back and demand the same thing. We need infrastructure for rain gardens in Dearborn and in Detroit and in Grosse Pointe. How much money a year is that happening for that? How much money, Sue McCormick said $17 billion for Southeast Michigan. Are you asking that of your senators? Are you asking that of your local state representatives? This is where the money hits the road, and we need to continue advocating. On a personal basis, plant native flowers, take out your lawn, plant your own food, buy less. All of those things are important, but they are income dependent, right? So we often say, like, claim your power where you can and act based on your ability.
So reduce, reuse, recycle, I think is always advisable to each and every the extent to one which you can do that. But there's a follow on, like the EJ, the environmental justice implications and considerations of new infrastructure. And again, if vacant land is used as a stormwater management asset, and that's owned by the land bank, how does that square with utility of residents? If you're living next to a vast swath of vacant land, say by City Airport, for example, between City or like French Road and Van Dyke. These are key questions. What kind of services do people see or get in the places that they live? So this is, I think, a lot of consideration needs to be going into this. There's a lot of good, I think, dialogue on the next door, east side communities. There are flood pages on Facebook and I think the key thing is consistency in information. That we really need good, solid, factual information about what is happening in our infrastructure. What is a combined versus a separate sewer system? What are the merits and the issues with check valves? Because once these get traction, and it's kind of like this for green infrastructure, once they get traction, they kind of suck all the oxygen out of the room, and your list of options becomes smaller, actually, because they all kind of fit into very fewer bins of action. And so I think having, these, putting investment into actually assessing where we're at, that's the quickest way to get to an improved infrastructure under constraint. Because if we don't catch the ball in the next bounce, I mean, this is not, that's not a good thing. There's, whether there's going to be a ball to be thrown to bounce, a couple of years from now is, I think, a reasonable question.
And I will leave it at that. I know we are at time, so I will kick it back over to Amber to help wrap us up. But thank you both so much for taking the time, and thanks to all the readers who joined today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Kelly. And I just want to give one last big thank you to Michelle and Bill for joining us today. I thought it was a really interesting and obviously very timely discussion. Thank you to Kelly and Catherine, my colleagues, for making this event possible. And lastly, but certainly not least, thank you so much to our Bridge readers for taking part in today's discussion. We did record this meeting and it will be posted in Bridge, Michigan tomorrow. So if you'd like to watch again, or someone who wanted to watch today but wasn't able to participate, please visit bridgemi.com tomorrow to watch the recording of today's discussion. We will resume our lunch break series, our monthly lunch break series next month in August. It looks like our next event will likely be the last week of August, and watch for details on topic and how to register in the very near future. Special shout out again to our Bridge members who make events like this possible. Thank you so much to all of you. And I hope that you enjoyed this event. Thank you so much and have a great day. We will talk with you soon. Take care.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.